Paldies, un turpinājumā mēs tad sāksim ar pirmo ideju vingrotavu. Un ideju vingrotavas mums, kā jau es minēju, būs 4, un šajā pirmajā mums ar savu klātbūtni ir aplaimojuši ārzemju eksperti, un kā pirmā no ārzemju ekspertiem runās Alise Rovstorna, starptautiski atzīta dizaina žurnāliste, New York Times, Frieze un citi, kritiķe, vairāku grāmatu autore. Hello World, Where Design Meets Life, autore. Vēlos vērst uzmanību, ka vēlreiz varēsim dzirdēt Alise šodien 7:00 vakarā, The Mills jaunajā, es pat nezinu, kā to lai nosauc, ar vienu jaunu definīcijas ir vajadzīgas šīm telpām, par kurām arī ministrs kundze runāja. Tātad The Mills brīvības dzirnavas stūrī, Unfolded 8 saucas pasākums. Un tagad es dodu vārdu Alisei. Katrā ziņā, pirms Alise sāk, es vēlos vērst uzmanību visiem tiem, kas skatās mūsu tiešraidē, ka varat uzdot jautājumus arī internetā, tātad Twitterī, lietojot hashtagu Radi Latviju. Un savukārt es ceru, ka visi ir pamanījuši, ja ne šeit uz tāfeles rakstīti, tad turpat uz kolonas ir izdruka ar Wi-Fi nosaukumu Radi Latviju, un paroli ir pavisam vienkārši Radi 2014. Un tagad vārds Alisei.
Thank you very much. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here. It's my first visit to Latvia, so I'm very much hoping to make the most of it, not least by seeing lots of your fabulous Art Nouveau architecture. But our theme, of course, is design thinking today, and I'm going to begin our gym session by talking about popular understanding and misunderstanding of both design and design thinking. And I'm going to begin by asking you to suspend disbelief and pretend that you've never seen something like this before. Obviously, it's a BlackBerry, but it could be a Galaxy or an iPhone. But if you'd never seen it, how could you possibly guess what it was intended to do? And could you believe that something so tiny, it's smaller and slimmer than a cigarette packet, has got more computing power than a great big bulldozer engine and can fulfill the functions of a phone, a clock, a DVD player, a sound system, an internet browser, and hundreds of other things too? Of course you couldn't, because there are no clues in the appearance of this object as to what it does. Now, the reason that so much computing power can be packed into something so small is thanks to these guys. They're the scientists at Bell Laboratories in New Jersey in the United States who invented the transistor in the late 1940s, first as a means of storing data, and they then made it smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, that's an incredible scientific achievement, but their work would never have left the laboratory and transformed the lives of billions of people if it hadn't been for design. Now, when most people think about what the design of a phone means, they think about what it looks like, but that's only a tiny portion of what design will have contributed to the phone, because it's thanks to the process of analysis, visualization, planning and execution that we call design that breakthroughs in scientific research, like this one, are translated into products like my BlackBerry that make our lives easier and more enjoyable. And it's thanks to the designers who develop the software with which we operate those devices that they can be so powerful. If that software was designed intelligently, then the device will work perfectly. But if it wasn't, it will disrupt and confuse our lives in many different ways. And we'll probably blame ourselves for not being able to operate it properly, even though it was the designer's fault. Now, design can empower and disempower us in every other aspect of our lives. When it's deployed wisely, it can bring us wisdom, pleasure, choice, strength, beauty, comfort, decency, sensitivity, integrity, and much more. But if design's power is abused, the outcome can be wasteful, confusing, humiliating, frightening, or dangerous. And design is inescapable. This is why it's so important. None of us can avoid being affected by it, because it's a ubiquitous element of our world that affects us, how we feel, what we do, and whether we succeed or fail, generally without our noticing. Now, we're able to decide whether or not to engage with most other aspects of life: cinema, art, fashion, music, sport. If you like any of those things very much, you can engage with them a lot, or maybe a little, or not at all, but we can't escape design, however much we might want to. All we can do is try to determine whether its impact on us will be positive or negative. And we can't do that unless we understand it. So the more thoroughly we understand design, the better for all of us. Now, my latest book, Hello World, explores design's influence on us now and in the future. And I chose the title partly as a reference to the first two words that appear on a computer screen whenever a new programming language has been designed, because programmers all over the world use those words. They come up as a result of a very basic test program called Hello World. And they use them as a tribute to a man called Dennis M. Ritchie, who sadly died 2 years ago, who was a research scientist, also at Bell Laboratories, who invented C language, which began the open source software movement. And he decided to invent a test program to test new languages and to make it as simple as possible, on the grounds that if that program didn't work, nothing else will. So all it does is spell out Hello World. And I thought it was a very beautiful idea that those words should appear on a screen whenever new languages are invented. But I also chose them as the title of the book because Hello World is such an eloquent way of describing what design does. Now, I have to disagree with the dean of the school, who said he thought that everybody understood what design is, because as far as I can see, everyone, myself included, is still struggling to understand it in the slightest. But as I write about design, I have to at least try, so I'm going to give it a go. And design is a complex, often elusive phenomenon that has changed dramatically over different times and in different contexts. But it has always had one elemental role, and that is to act as an agent of change that helps us to make sense of what's happening around us and to turn it to our advantage. Because every single design exercise sets out to change something, whether it's to transform the lives of millions of people or to minorly affect just one person. And it does so systematically. And at its best, design is one of the most powerful tools at our disposal to ensure that changes of any type, whether they're scientific, technological, political, economic, cultural, environmental, or whatever, are introduced to the world in ways that are positive and empowering, rather than inhibiting and destructive. And I'm guessing that most of the people in this room will agree with me, because you, like me, will be passionate about design. But of course, most people aren't. They don't understand design. They confuse it with styling, with expensive, uncomfortable chairs, gas-guzzling cars, or silly shoes. And they typecast it as a ploy to trick us into buying things of dubious value that we'll swiftly tire of and abandon in places like this. This is the horrible Abergloshi dump near Accra in Ghana, which is where so many of the West computers are shipped to die. Now, the confusion about design isn't surprising, because any word with such a long history will be redefined over the centuries, but few words have ended up being quite as ambiguous as design. I mean, it's a noun, it's a verb, it's an adverb, it can even be an adjective. And the more meanings it has acquired, the more elusive it has become, because so many of the new interpretations sit oddly with the old ones. And I believe that for as long as there's no clear consensus about what design represents, it will continue to be prey to muddles and cliches. And you could say, does that matter? Because design has already achieved an enormous amount to improve our lives, but I would argue that it does, because the confusion about design stops society from realizing its full potential. If you draw an allusion with healthcare, if a hospital only decided to treat physical ailments and not psychological ones, we'd all agree it was giving an inadequate service to its patients. And the same applies to design. If it is just seen as being something that produces stratospherically heeled shoes and crazy chairs, then society, governments, NGOs, investors, and so on, are less likely to think that it can tackle more important challenges, like making a constructive contribution to addressing the environmental crisis or to tackling acute social problems. So in Hello World, I ask whether design can overcome those misconceptions to make an even more meaningful contribution to our lives in future. And critically, this will involve design no longer being used solely as a styling or commercial tool, but as a process that can be applied in many, many different contexts, the process that we now describe as design thinking. Now, this is nothing new. Both design and design thinking have happened for centuries, but not necessarily in ways that have been identified as having anything to do with design. Because long before the word design exists, human beings practiced design instinctively, starting with prehistoric men and women whenever they did anything to affect their surroundings, like barricading their caves with rocks against predators. They acted as designers by doing so. And so did these guys. The man with the big black beard and the silly hat in the middle is Blackbeard, and he was one of the most famous English pirates of the early 18th century. And piracy was then one of Britain's most successful industries. English pirates terrorized the high seas. It was a very profitable and prosperous era of peace in Europe. Colonial trade was thriving. New York emerged as the thriving black market, so no change there, you could say. And so pirates like Blackbeard realized that the more efficiently they ran their ships, the more money they would make. And the single most effective thing they could do was to try and terrify their victims into surrendering immediately. So they didn't waste any ammunition or weapons, and they didn't risk the lives of any of their crew. So what they started doing, if you look in the top right-hand corner, you'll just see the flag that's flown on Blackbeard's ship. And it, of course, has the familiar symbol of the skull and crossbones, a human skull and a pair of crossbones. And no one knows why, but in the early years of the 18th century, dozens of pirates all over the world started to fly that identical symbol because it was incredibly effective at terrifying their victims into surrendering. It communicates its message incredibly clearly. Give up or you'll be sorry, because I'm brutal, deadly, and I'll kill you if I've got to. So if you look at it now, that's a brilliant example of communications design. Not that anyone ever congratulated Blackbeard on being a designer, but to me, he's one of the most successful practitioners of this. This Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, the great Bauhaus teacher, is one of my own design heroes, and he came up with this brilliant quote: "Design is not a profession, but an attitude." And I think this goes to the heart of Blackbeard's success with the skull and crossbones and to what design is. Now, I'm now going to look at just two applications, contemporary applications of design and design thinking. And the first is a contemporary application of design's traditional role in interpreting scientific innovations to good use. And one of the big problems that society faces today is what The Economist magazine calls data deluge. This is the ever-increasing torrent of data that's surging out of computers. So much information that we haven't got a clue what to do with it. So a group of American designers came to the rescue by developing a programming language called processing. And this is a form of design software that produces what we now call data visualizations. So these are constantly updatable digital images that crunch through incredibly complex, huge quantities of data and help us to make sense of it. One of my favorite examples is this one. It's called Humans versus Chimps, and it was designed by Ben Fry, who is one of the developers of processing. And as you can see, it creates a photographic image of a chimpanzee. And the image is made up of this. These are the 75,000 characters in the computer code for the difference between the chimp's genome and the human genome. So this picture shows the chimpanzee's genome, and you can see that of the 75,000 characters in the code, only 9 of them are picked out in red dots. Those are the only differences between the computer coding of a chimp's genome and ours, as human beings. So that crystallizes the genetic difference between us and chimpanzees. Now, I don't know about you, but I could read dozens of scientific texts on that subject and still not understand the difference. I look at this brilliant data visualization and I understand it immediately. And my next example is using design in a less conventional way. And this is an example of the growing discipline of social design. And one of the leaders in the field is a British design group called Participle, which has the modest ambition of redesigning the welfare state. And it's run by the social scientist turned social designer Hilary Cottam. And one of Participle's earliest projects was to tackle a problem that affects economies all over the world, particularly mature economies like the UK's, and this is the rapidly expanding elderly population and how we care for them. And Participle was challenged by a local council in Britain to come up with a more efficient but less expensive way of caring for elderly people in the borough. And it came up with this concept, which it calls the circles. And the idea is that elderly people within local communities join their local circle. When they join, an existing member of the circle visits them to discuss their needs, whether they don't know how to cook, perhaps their partner died and they took care of the gardening and they can't do that either, but critically to also ask what their skills are, what they can contribute to other people. So maybe they've got good computer skills, so they can teach other people how to email or to Skype, or they're good at accounts, or they're just willing to sit with people when a plumber calls so they don't feel quite so scared. And so in other words, the circles are a sort of combination of a social group, what we call Derby and Joan clubs in Britain, a concierge service, and a sort of self-help group. And they have been so successful because in principle each member receives the support they actually need, but are also empowered by helping other people. So they're not just passive recipients in the way they've tended to be with conventional elderly care packages. And Participle was so successful in its early projects that they've now been adopted by different councils all over the United Kingdom. And Participle has gone on to work in lots of other fields, helping young people to integrate with their local communities and helping families in chronic crisis to do the same. So to me, their work makes a compelling case for design to be given greater responsibility at a time when we desperately need it to do so, because of course we face changes in our lives at the moment at unprecedented speed, scale and intensity. So just to run through some of the challenges and opportunities that design and design thinking faces in the future. Advances in science and technology are accelerating at an extraordinary pace, thanks to innovations. Okay, 2 minutes. Innovations like CERN, the Large Hadron Collider near Geneva, and all the incredible advances in physics that are coming out of there. The environmental crisis is deepening. The economic gulf between rich and poor is deepening too. And the social and political systems that regulated society in the last century are breaking down. One of the reasons why Participle has been able to do so much work, as they admit themselves, is because the social services and social sciences are in crisis. They still adhere to 20th century methodologies that simply aren't fit for purpose in the 21st century. And if you look at your own life, the logistics of it and the objects that fill it are changing dramatically. They're dramatically different from what they were 10 years ago, and they'll be dramatically different again in 10 years' time, making a nonsense about many of the old assumptions about how we want to live and what we value. Now, design and design thinking are not panaceas for any of these problems, far from it, but they are among our most powerful tools to resolve them, providing, and I go back to the beginning, they're deployed intelligently. And the first step is to get to grips with what they are, which is why I wrote Hello World. So thank you.
Thank you very much. If we would just have 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Vai ir kādi jautājumi? Var droši jautāt latviski, un mēs nodosim Alisei angļu valodā. Joprojām vērš uzmanību uz visiem tiem, kur pacēla rokas pašā sākumā. Nemaz tik sen tas nebija. Viens jautājums.
Actually,
diskusijas laikā.
If no one has a question for me, I have a question for the audience.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's,
Okay.
that's some design thinking.
I would like to know, obviously for me, it's great to be in Latvia and to find out about design here. So can any of you tell me what you consider to be the greatest successes of Latvian design in recent years? What you found really exciting and inspiring or useful?
Mums ir iespēja palielīties ar labāko Latvijas dizainu. Šis nav īstais brīdis, lai turētu rokas klēpī. Oh, that's just great. So there will be a material distributed afterwards, which will feature the great design that you were asking for.
Great.
Okay, so I just have a very brief question. You referred to the pirates, and I admire pirates a lot. So speaking of design and 21st century, we have a lot of piracy nowadays too. What do you believe is the role of piracy and design thinking?
Well, it's an excellent question because although design tends to be presented in a very sort of calm, calculated, rational way, that it can always be understood logically and systematically, there is an amazing history of disruptive design, whether it's piracy or hacking, and many of our greatest design innovations have actually come out of an urge to disrupt. So if you look at the design history of the internet in particular, that it has played an enormously important role there. So the skull and crossbones is a very literal way of suggesting that design played a role in piracy, and this incredibly successful trade that actually embraced design instinctively in a very effective way. But I would urge you, just as the magazine was dangled at me, I would urge you to look at a really fantastic design project, which is an online exhibition that has been produced by the Museum of Modern Art. And it's called Design and Violence. And I think the URL is moma.org/design and violence, but you'll easily find it on a search engine. And this is all about design and violence in the broadest possible sense. So violence in the sense of disruption and piracy and hacking, as well as brutality and destruction. And not only are there brilliant examples there, but the debates about them are really fascinating. So that would be a great thing to follow up on.
Thank you very much, Alice.
Thank you.
Mēs varam vēlreiz aplaudēt.